If we are to consider the idea of convincing God, we must first ask ourselves, is it truly about changing God's mind, or is it about transforming our own? When we come before the Creator with our desires, our hopes, and even our frustrations, we often think we are asking for a shift in divine will. But what if the real shift needs to happen within us? What if convincing God is not about altering His plan, but aligning our hearts with it? Throughout history, people have wrestled with the tension between human desire and divine will. We see it in ancient scriptures, in the cries of the prophets, in the prayers of the faithful who have sought answers in the silence of the night. There is a longing in the human soul to understand, to be heard, to see the hand of God move in response to our deepest needs. But is God simply waiting for us to say the right words, to present the most compelling argument, as though He is a judge to be swayed? Or is there something deeper at play? God's will is not a rigid, unyielding force that stands in cold detachment from human suffering. It is a living, breathing expression of divine love, moving through time and history with purpose beyond what we can see. Yet we, in our finite understanding, often struggle to reconcile that with our own immediate desires. We want healing when sickness strikes. We want provision when resources run dry. We want deliverance when the weight of the world feels too heavy to bear. And so we plead with God, hoping that if we just say the right words, if we just pray a little harder, perhaps He will change His mind and give us what we ask. But let me tell you this, God is not a being to be persuaded as if He were uncertain. He is not withholding blessings out of reluctance, waiting for us to convince Him otherwise. The very fact that we seek Him at all is evidence that He has already begun His work within us. When we come before Him in prayer, the transformation begins not necessarily in our circumstances, but in our hearts. Think about the moments in life when you were desperate for an answer, when you wanted something so deeply that you cried out to heaven for a sign. And yet, how often has the answer come in a form you did not expect? How often has God moved? Not by changing the situation, but by changing you. That is the mystery of divine will. God is not in the business of simply granting wishes. He is in the business of refining souls. Consider the story of a man who prayed earnestly for success, for wealth, for recognition. He sought to convince God that his dreams were worth fulfilling. But over time, as he continued in prayer, something shifted within him. He began to see that his definition of success was limited. That what he truly longed for was not wealth, but purpose. Not recognition, but impact. And in that realization, he found that God had been leading him all along, not toward what he originally desired, but toward something far greater. When Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane, facing the agony of the cross, he made a plea that echoes through eternity. Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me. But then in the very next breath, he spoke the words that define the heart of surrender, yet not my will, but yours be done. That moment was not about convincing God to change the course of history. It was about aligning with the divine purpose that was already unfolding. And because of that surrender, redemption was brought to the world. Many people approach faith as though it is a negotiation. They think if I am good enough, if I pray hard enough, if I give enough, then surely God will grant my request. But faith is not a transaction, it is a relationship, and relationships are built on trust, not persuasion. The more we seek to convince God, the more we must ask ourselves, do we trust Him enough to believe that His will is already what is the best for us? Perhaps the real question is not how do I convince God, but rather how do I let God convince me? Convince me that His ways are higher than mine. Convince me that His timing is perfect even when I don't understand it. Convince me that His love is unwavering even when my prayers seem unanswered, because when we allow ourselves to be convinced by Him, we no longer approach Him with desperation but with faith. And faith, true faith, is not about bending God's will to match ours, but about bending our will to match His. So the next time you find yourself on your knees pleading for an answer, take a moment to listen. Because sometimes the answer isn't in God changing His mind. Sometimes the answer is in God changing you. 2/2. When we speak of coming before God, asking, seeking, even hoping to move His heart, there is something that goes beyond the words we say. It's deeper than the request we bring. It's the condition of the heart that matters most. You see, God is not persuaded by eloquence. He's not impressed by grand speeches or perfectly crafted prayers. He looks past all of that straight into the core of who we are, and what he is searching for is sincerity. He is searching for faith. I have met people who have said to me, I've prayed and prayed, but God hasn't answered me. What am I doing wrong? And sometimes their voices tremble with hurt, sometimes with frustration. They begin to believe that maybe they didn't pray hard enough or long enough, or maybe they didn't get the words quite right. But let me tell you, God is not measuring the length of your prayers. He is not weighing the beauty of your words. What moves the heart of God is the heart behind the prayer. It is the cry of a sincere heart, an honest heart that reaches heaven. You can say 1,000 words, but if your heart is far from God, those words are empty. And yet you can whisper just one word, help, and if it comes from a place of genuine faith, it shakes the heavens. Because God is not looking for perfection. He is looking for trust. He is looking for the child who comes to their father and says, I don't have it all together, but I need you. You see, we often overcomplicate prayer. We treat it like a formula, as though if we get the steps right, we'll unlock God's favor. But God is not a distant figure holding blessings behind a locked door, waiting for us to crack the code. He is a father. And a father is moved by the heart of his child. When a little child runs to their father with tears in their eyes, they don't come with polished sentences. They don't think about saying the right thing. They simply run arms outstretched and cry, Daddy, and that is enough. That is more than enough. There is power in sincerity. There is power in faith that comes from a place of complete dependence. When we come to God not with a list of demands, but with an open heart, we are saying, God, I trust you more than I trust myself. And that kind of faith, simple, pure, desperate faith, that's what moves mountains. Not because our faith is so great, but because our faith connects us to a great God. I have seen faith like that in the eyes of a mother sitting beside her sick child. She doesn't pray with fancy words. She simply clings to God because he is all she has. I've seen it in the heart of a man who lost everything, his home, his family, and yet he lifted his hands and said, God, you are still good. That is faith. That is sincerity. And it is in those moments when we have nothing left to offer but our broken hearts that God's presence becomes most real. Faith is not about having all the answers. It's about trusting the one who does. Sincerity is not about having it all together. It's about coming as you are. Because God already knows you. He knows your doubts, your fears, your questions. And he invites you to bring them to him, not hide them. You don't have to clean yourself up before you approach God. He wants you to come to him with the mess, with the confusion, with the pain. He wants you to be real. Some people think that having faith means never questioning God, but I believe faith sometimes looks like saying, God, I don't understand this. I don't like this, but I'm still choosing to trust you. That's faith. That's sincerity. And that's what touches the heart of God. There's a story in the Bible about a woman who had been sick for 12 long years. She had spent everything she had on doctors, but nothing worked. And one day she heard that Jesus was passing through her town. She didn't have a grand plan. She didn't prepare a speech. She didn't even approach him face to face. She simply thought, if I could just touch the hem of his robe, I'll be healed. That's it. That was her prayer, not spoken aloud, not polished, just a desperate thought from a sincere heart. And when she reached out and touched him, Jesus stopped. He turned and said, who touched me? The disciples were confused. There was a crowd pressing around him, but Jesus knew someone had touched him with faith. Someone had reached out with a heart that believed. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has healed you. That's the kind of faith God is looking for, a faith that doesn't need to be seen, a faith that doesn't need recognition, a faith that simply believes that God is who he says he is, a faith that reaches out in the middle of the crowd and says, God, I need you. I know there are some of you here today who are carrying burdens no one else can see. You've been praying for something for a long time and you're starting to wonder if God is even listening. Let me tell you, he hears you. He sees you, and more than that, he knows you. He is not ignoring you. He is drawing you closer. Sometimes we come to God asking for one thing, and he gives us something far greater. He gives us himself. So don't stop praying. Don't stop believing. But most of all, don't try to convince God with your words. Come to him with your heart. Come to him with faith, however small it may be. because faith, even the size of a mustard seed, can move mountains. And when you approach God with sincerity and trust, you will find that He has been waiting for you all along. There's something in every one of us that longs to see the hand of God move. We want to see Him act in our lives in big ways, in personal ways. We want Him to part the sea for us like He did for Moses. We want Him to calm the storm like He did for the disciples. We want Him to speak into our situation with power, to show us that He hears, that He's with us, that He cares. And sometimes when we pray and the answer doesn't come as quickly as we'd hoped, or when it doesn't come the way we wanted, we start to wonder. We start to ask questions. We start to wrestle with doubts. Why hasn't God answered me? Does He see me? Does He care? Have I done something wrong? And deep down we might even ask, is He even there? I understand those questions. I've asked them myself. I know what it's like to wait on God. I know what it's like to carry a burden so heavy it feels like it might crush you. I know what it's like to cry out in the darkness and hear nothing but silence. But I've also learned something in those seasons of waiting, something I wouldn't trade for anything. I've learned that God's silence is not His absence, and I've learned that His timing is not our timing. You see, God is never late. He's never early. He is always right on time. And when He moves with purpose. But here's the thing, God often works in ways we don't expect. We pray for deliverance. And sometimes He gives us endurance. We pray for the storm to end, and sometimes He strengthens us to stand in the middle of it. We pray for the mountain to be removed, and sometimes He gives us the courage to climb it. And it's in those moments when we don't get what we ask for, that faith is tested the most. Because real faith isn't proven when everything is going right. Real faith is proven when we're still holding on to God, even when we don't withstand. I met a woman once who had been through more pain than most of us can imagine. She had lost her husband, and not long after she lost her son. She told me there were nights she would lie in bed and cry until she had no tears left. She said there were days she didn't know how she was going to get out of bed, but every morning she would whisper a simple prayer, God, I need you. And every morning He gave her the strength to take one more step. She didn't get the answer she had prayed for. Her husband and her son were not brought back to her. But she got something else, something she hadn't even known to ask for. She got the presence of God. She got His peace. She got His strength. She got His comfort. And she told me with tears in her eyes, I wouldn't have made it without Him. That's the mystery of God's grace. He may not always give us what we ask for, but He always gives us what we need. And more often than not, what we need most is Him. You see, prayer is not just about changing our circumstances. Prayer is about changing us. It's about drawing close to God. It's about learning to trust Him, not because we get the answers we want, but because we come to know His heart. And when we know His heart, we can face anything. When we know His heart, we can stand in the storm and say, God, I don't understand, but I trust you. That kind of trust is not easy. It doesn't come overnight. It's built in the waiting. It's forged in the fire. It grows in the places where we have nothing left to hold on to but God Himself. And when we reach that point when we can say, God, even if you don't change this situation, I will still trust you, we find something we never expected. We find peace. We find strength. We find joy, not because our problems disappear, but because we are held by the one who is greater than our problems. There's a story in the Bible about three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were thrown into a fiery furnace because they refused to bow down to a king's idol. Before they were thrown in, they made a statement that has echoed through history. They said, our God is able to deliver us, but even if He does not, we will not bow. That's faith, that's trust, that's the kind of confidence that comes when you know who God is. They believed God could save them, but they also trusted Him enough to say, even if He doesn't, we're still with Him. And you know what happened? God did keep them from the fire. He met them in it. The king looked into that furnace and saw not 3 men, but 4, because God was with them. And He's with you too, in the fire, in the storm, in the waiting. Some of you are in that place right now. You're waiting for an answer. You're praying for a breakthrough. You're asking God to move. And maybe you're starting to feel like He's not listening. Maybe you're starting to feel like He's forgotten you. But I'm here to tell you He hasn't. He sees you. There's something that happens when we begin to truly seek God, not just with our lips, but with our lives. When we stop viewing prayer as a quick request line and start seeing it as an invitation into relationship, everything begins to shift. You see, prayer was never meant to be a monologue. It was never meant to be a list of things we want sent up to heaven like a shopping list, hoping God will check off each item. Prayer is a dialogue. Prayer is communion with the living God. And the moment we understand that, the way we approach Him begins to change. I've met people who say, I pray, but I never hear from God. And often my question to them is this: are you listening? Because prayer is not just about speaking, it is about listening. We pour out our hearts before God, but do we pause long enough to hear what He might be saying in return? Sometimes we ask God to show us the way, but we are moving so quickly we miss the gentle whisper pointing us in the right direction. God often speaks in stillness. He speaks in quiet moments. And if we rush through prayer as though it's a duty to check off, we risk missing the very voice we long to hear. There's a story in Scripture about a man named Elijah. He was a prophet, a man who had seen the power of God with his own eyes. He had stood on Mount Carmel and watched fire fall from heaven. He had witnessed miracles. But there came a time when he was tired, afraid, and desperate to hear from God. He went to a mountain and waited. And as he stood there, a mighty wind tore through the place, but God was not in the wind. Then an earthquake shook the ground, but God was not in the earthquake. After that, a fire blazed through the mountain, but God was not in the fire. And then, after all the noise had passed, there came a gentle whisper. And in that whisper, Elijah heard God. That's the kind of God we serve. He is not always found in the loud, the dramatic, the grand displays of power. Sometimes He is found in the stillness. Sometimes He is found in the quiet voice that speaks to your heart when the world is silent. But to hear that voice, we have to slow down. We have to listen. And listening is not easy in a world filled with noise. Our lives are crowded with distractions, phones buzzing, schedules packed, minds racing. But when we make the choice to carve out space to sit before God with no agenda other than to be with Him, we begin to experience what prayer was meant to be: communion with the Father. There is power in waiting. There is power in being still before God. But we often resist it because waiting feels like inaction. We live in a world that celebrates speed, faster results, quicker answers, immediate gratification. But God is not bound by our clocks. His timing is perfect, even when it does not align with ours. And sometimes the waiting is the answer. Sometimes what God is doing in you during the waiting is more important than what you're waiting for. I remember speaking to a woman who had been praying for her prodigal son for years. She had wept, pleaded, fasted, done everything she knew to do, and still her son remained far from God. She told me, I don't know if my prayers are working, but as we talked, I saw something remarkable in her. Her faith had grown deeper. Her trust in God had become stronger. Her heart had become tender toward others who were hurting. She thought nothing was happening, but God was shaping her into someone who reflected His love in ways she never could have imagined. Her prayers were not just changing her son's future, they were changing her. That's what happens when we stay in communion with God. Our prayers may begin with a request, but over time they lead us into something greater. They lead us into His presence, and in His presence we are transformed. We start to see things differently. We begin to desire what He desires. Our hearts begin to break for what breaks His. We are no longer merely asking for blessings, we are asking to become a blessing. That is the power of communion with God. I believe some of you know what it means to cry out to God day after day, waiting for a breakthrough. And maybe you're still waiting. Maybe you're wondering if God even hears you. Let me tell you, He hears you. He knows every tear you've cried, and He is not only working on your situation, He is working on you. Sometimes we come to God asking for a change in our circumstances, but God is more concerned with changing our hearts. He is forming Christ in us. He is making us more like Him. And that work, the work of shaping our hearts, that is the greatest answer to prayer we could ever receive. I think of Jesus, who often withdrew to quiet places to pray. The Son of God, who had all power, all authority, still sought time alone with His Father. Not out of obligation, but out of desire, because communion with God is not a burden, it is a gift. It is where our souls find rest. It is where we are reminded that we are loved not because of what we do, but because of who He is. So when you pray, don't just come with your list of needs. Come with your heart. Come to listen. Come to be with him. Because God is not merely interested in granting your requests. He is interested in drawing you closer. He is interested in transforming you into someone who reflects his love in this world. That is what prayer is about. That is what communion with God is about. And when you understand that, you will find that you are no longer trying to convince God, you are allowing him to change you. There's something we all carry within us, though we may not always recognize it. It's this need to know that we matter, that our voice is heard, that our life is not drifting unnoticed in a vast universe. And often we bring that same need into our relationship with God. We want to know that our prayers reach him. We want to believe that he listens when we speak, that our struggles matter to him. But there's a lie that sneaks in, sometimes a voice that whispers, maybe you're not good enough. Maybe you haven't earned his attention. Maybe he listens to others, but not to you. And that lie can creep into our hearts and build walls between us and God. But I want you to hear this. You don't have to earn God's attention. You already have it. From the moment you took your first breath, God saw you. He knew you. He loved you. You are not a stranger to him. You are his child. And when his children speak, he listens. Not because we've done everything right, not because we've prayed perfectly, but because we belong to him. I've met people who say, I try to pray, but I don't feel anything. I don't feel close to God. And sometimes they wonder if that means they're doing it wrong. But faith isn't built on feelings. Feelings come and go. Faith is built on trust. Trust that God is who he says he is, even when we can't feel him. Trust that he is near, even when he seems silent. Trust that his love for us is constant, even when we feel unworthy. There was a woman I spoke to once who had been through more pain than most of us could imagine. She had lost her husband in a tragic accident. She was left alone to raise her 3 children. She told me, I prayed every day for God to protect my family, and still this happened. I don't understand. And I sat with her in that grief, and I didn't have answers. Sometimes there are no answers this side of heaven. But what I saw in her was something remarkable. Even through the pain, even through the questions, she still prayed. She still clung to God. She said, there are days I'm angry. There are days I don't know what to say, but I talk to him anyway because I know he's the only one who can carry this with me. That's faith. That's relationship. It's not pretending everything is okay. It's coming to God with the broken pieces and saying, I don't understand, but I need you. And what I've seen over and over again is that when we come to God like that, honestly, vulnerably, he meets us there. Sometimes he changes our circumstances, but more often he changes us. He gives us the strength to keep going. He gives us peace that doesn't make sense. He gives us hope when everything seems dark. You see, prayer is not about convincing God to give us what we want. It's about bringing our hearts to him and letting him work in us. It's about trust. Trust that he is good even when life is hard. Trust that he is working even when we can't see it. Trust that he loves us even when we feel unworthy. And trust requires surrender. That's the part we struggle with the most. We want to hold on. We want control. We want to tell God how things should go. But real faith is letting go. It's saying, God, I don't understand, but I trust you. It's opening our hands and releasing our plans, our fears, our hurts, and trusting that his hands are bigger, stronger, and gentler than ours. There's a verse in the Bible that says, cast all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. Not because you've earned it, not because you deserve it, but because he cares for you. That's who he is. A God who cares. A father who loves. A shepherd who carries his sheep when they're too weak to walk. I remember talking to a man who had spent his whole life trying to prove himself to his family, to his co-workers, even to God. He told me I always felt like I had to perform to show that I was good enough. But then something happened. He lost his job. He went through a divorce. Everything he had built his identity on was stripped away. And in that place of brokenness, he met God not as someone he had to impress, but as someone who loved him just as he was. He said, I realized for the first time I don't have to prove anything to God. He loves me because I'm his. That's the kind of relationship God wants with us. Not one based on performance, but on love. Not one driven by fear, but by trust. When we understand that, our prayers begin to change. We stop coming to God like beggars hoping for scraps. we come as children, confident that our Father loves us and that He knows what's best. Some of you might be sitting here today carrying burdens you haven't told anyone about. Maybe you've been trying to fix things on your own. Maybe you've been afraid to bring it to God because you think you need to clean yourself up first, but you don't. He's waiting for you right now, as you are. You don't need to have it all figured out. You just need to come. Come with your fears. Come with your doubts. Come with your questions. And trust that He will meet you there. Because He will. He always does. He may not answer the way you expect. He may not move on your timeline, but He will be with you. And sometimes that's the greatest miracle of all. Not that our circumstances change, but that we are no longer alone in them. So today, whatever you're carrying, whatever you're facing, bring it to Him, lay it at His feet, and trust that the same God who created the stars, the same God who holds the universe together is holding you, and He will never let you go. There comes a moment in every life when we face a choice, a moment when we must decide what we truly believe about God, whether He is distant and uninvolved, or whether He is near and cares deeply about us. And more than that, we must decide whether we will trust Him enough to surrender not just our words, not just our prayers, but our whole lives into His hands. Because the truth is, to convince God of anything is not really about changing His mind. It is about aligning our hearts with His. And that alignment requires surrender. Surrender is not a word we like to hear. It sounds like weakness. It sounds like defeat. We live in a world that tells us to fight for control, to make our own way, to hold on tightly to our plans, our dreams, our futures. But God's kingdom is different. His ways are not our ways. In God's eyes, surrender is not weakness. Surrender is the ultimate act of trust. It is saying, God, I believe you know better than I do. I believe your plan is greater than mine. I believe you love me more than I can understand, so I let go. I place my life, every part of it, in your hand. I've met people who have tried to hold on to everything, trying to manage it all on their own, and they end up exhausted physically, emotionally, spiritually. They carry the weight of their lives on their shoulders, believing it's all up to them. But the human soul was not made to carry that kind of burden. We were created to walk with God, to lean on Him, to depend on Him, to rest in Him. And surrender is the key that unlocks that rest. But surrender is not easy. It requires us to lay down our pride. It requires us to admit that we are not in control, that we never were. It requires us to face the reality that we don't have all the answers. And for some, that's terrifying, because control feels safe, even if it's an illusion. But God calls us to something better. He calls us to freedom. And freedom is found on the other side of surrender. I remember a man who came to me after a service once. He was successful by every worldly standard. A good career, a beautiful family, a reputation people admired. But he was burdened. He said, I've worked so hard to build this life, but I'm afraid every day that it could all fall apart. I'm afraid if I make one wrong move, I'll lose everything. And I looked at him and said, what would it look like if you handed it all to God? What if you trusted Him with what you've built, with your family, with your future? And tears filled his eyes because he realized he had never really done that. He had believed in God. He had prayed, but he had never surrendered. There's a story in the Bible about Abraham. God had promised him a son. promised that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars. And after years of waiting, that promise came true. Isaac was born, the child Abraham and Sarah had dreamed of. But then came the test. God asked Abraham to take that beloved son, the very promise God had given him, and lay him on an altar, to surrender him. Can you imagine the agony in Abraham's heart? Everything he had hoped for, everything he had prayed for, was being asked back. And yet Abraham obeyed. He trusted that God's plan was good, even when he didn't understand it. He surrendered the most precious thing in his life. And in that surrender, God provided. He spared Isaac and showed Abraham that he is a God who provides. That is the heart of surrender. It is trusting that even when God asks us to let go, he is not taking from us. He is making room for something greater. He is asking us to open our hands so that he can fill them with his goodness. But we can't receive what God has for us if our hands are clenched tightly around what we refuse to release. I know there are people here today who are holding on to something. Maybe it's your plans for the future. Maybe it's a relationship. Maybe it's a dream you've had since you were young, and you're afraid that if you surrender it to God, he might take it away. But let me tell you this. Whatever you place in God's hands is always safer than when you hold it in your own. He is not a cruel God. He's not looking to rob you of joy. He is a loving Father who longs to lead you into a life that is fuller and richer than anything you could design for yourself. Sometimes surrender means giving up something we desperately wanted. Sometimes it means releasing a hurt that we've held on to for years. Sometimes it means trusting God with the unknowns, the things that keep us up at night. But in every case, surrender leads to peace. Because when we let go, we place our lives into the hands of the one who created us, the one who knows every hair on our heads, the one who has already written our story from beginning to end. There was a woman I knew who battled cancer for years. She prayed for healing, and so did everyone around her. But as time went on, she came to a place of surrender. She said, I still pray for healing, but more than that, I pray that God would use my life, whether in healing or in suffering, to bring him glory. And in that surrender, she found peace. She found freedom from fear. She found that no matter what happened to her body, her soul was secure. That's what surrender does. It frees us from fear. It frees us from the exhausting need to control. It frees us to live fully in the present, knowing that our future is held by the one who loves us most. And when we live in that kind of trust, our relationship with God deepens. We stop seeing him as someone to bargain with. We stop trying to convince him to give us what we want. Instead, we rest in the knowledge that he is for us, that he is with us, and that his plans for us are always good, even when we can't see it. So today, whatever you are holding on to, whatever you are afraid to release, I want to challenge you to place it in God's hands. Trust him with it. Open your heart to him. Surrender. And you will find that the peace you've been searching for is waiting on the other side. Because the greatest freedom, the deepest joy, and the closest communion with God always begin with these simple words: Lord, I trust you.